Hey everyone, it's Root Beer. We've got Springfest coming up this weekend, so I figured we'd try out a new little idea where we go through our deck lists that we plan to use for the tournament, kind of talk about all of our deck building decisions, what we think we're going to come up against, and then follow it up with a little after tournament report to kind of talk about how the deck list goes. So, let's get started on that, shall we? So for me personally, I plan on taking Hexaorb to Springfest because we did some test games the other day between me and Atlas, and which, by the way, we're going to have videos of those in the coming weeks, so look forward to that. But, while I was playing those lists, Bastion just wasn't really clicking with me, and so out of all the other available options I had were like this, Bruce, and I guess Borrow Magnus, but I haven't really built out Borrow Magnus, and I haven't really play tested it too much, so I don't feel super confident bringing that, and honestly, I just don't really like the deck right now. And then Bruce, I actually quite enjoy. I think Bruce is a really fun deck, it's just, it also requires a lot of brain juice, so that kind of leaves me with Hexaorb here. So, I'm just running the main ride line, not a whole lot of reason not to. Unfortunately, Bastion's line does require you to have Bastion at the end of it to get its effect off, otherwise I might actually consider it because, as we'll see coming up, I actually do play a decent number of grade 3s. And speaking of grade 3s, let's get started on those, shall we? Just clear this off here. So, obviously, we're going to have our 3 other copies of Hexaorb, because, unfortunately, you just need to Persona Ride to do anything with this deck. I really don't like that, which I've made pretty clear on the podcast before, but, there we go. So, 3 copies of Hexaorb. We have 4 copies of Fasciata. This deck is going to be very counterblast heavy once I start going into all of my other grades of cards, so Fasciata is something that, unfortunately, is just kind of required to help curb a lot of the resource cost in the deck. It's a very important rearguard, which is why I've decided to maximize my copies of it. You're going to see as I go through my list. I actually run a whole lot of 3-ofs just because there were a lot of cards I was thinking that I might want to run, and, a lot of them, unfortunately, I just couldn't fit a maximum 4 copies, so I think this is the only card aside from like triggers and PGs that I'm running the full 4 copies of. And just because there's going to be a wide variety of things, the ability to not be chosen by opponent's card effects is pretty handy. So it means like Eden's on hit, Verena, and just Prison as a whole isn't going to be able to touch this card with their card effects. They're going to have to waste extra attacks, and you have a chance to be able to actually defend him. So, very important rearguard, maximum copies. Next we have Divine Sister Lapisto. So, I'm running 3 copies of this card, mostly just because of how expensive it is, especially alongside the next grade 3 we're going to talk about, but very important card for offense, so when our drive check reveals a trigger unit, when our trigger check reveals a drive unit, you can counterblast 2, restand this unit, and it gets 5k, so checking triggers is Hexaorb's bread and butter. This helps add a whole lot of offense. I think most JP lists I see actually do max out copies of this, but just for the sake of making room for a bunch of other cards I have opted to play, I cut it down to 3 because Counterblast 2 is a lot. So, speaking of Counterblasting 2, we also have 3 copies of Alden in the deck, so as I was putting my list together, I was thinking about, my trigger ratios, and I came to realize that this deck doesn't actually plus a whole lot, because with Hexaorb's skill, you have a triple drive, but the thing is, you're likely putting a trigger back on top of your deck, so if you do that, then it means you're not actually plussing anymore, because, you put a card back, you're just taking it back with the drive check. That's a kind of a net 0, so you're not gaining anything there, and aside from that, there's going to be Painkiller Angel, which we'll get to later, but that is an extra counterblast, or that retires itself, so even though you're drawing a card off of it, it's also not really a plus because you have to lose Angel herself. So I opted to run Alden because I already have a decent number of grade 3s with Lapisto and Fasciata, so I figure most of the time I will be able to resolve its skill if it comes to that. And if I can't, likely this and either Lapisto or Fasciata on the board means I still have just a solid 18k beater, so I've opted for 3 copies of Alden. I was thinking of doing 4 Lapisto and 2 of this, but I've had really bad luck in Bastion not drawing Aldens when I need them, so I've kind of opted for 3/3 instead. I figure better chances to see one or both of these cards. Moving into the grade 2, I only have 3 of them, because there are just so many things I want to be playing in this deck right now that I couldn't find space for any other grade 2s, but I have 3 copies of Pentagleam Sorceress, so, she's the Ride Line grade 2, but also, when placed, you can scry the top card of your deck and put it on top or bottom, and you get 2k, so, just the top check. It's a nice little disposable rearguard early for that. You can try your luck for a trigger, and, late game, you can either intercept with it to make room for the more impactful rearguards in the grade 3s, or just kind of use it as discard fodder or just a 5k shield. Kind of a filler card, all things considered. Like, the top check definitely helps just trying to dig for more triggers to get your deck rolling, but it's probably the most replaceable card in my list right now. And then we have Painkiller Angel, so 3 copies of her. A lot of JP lists I've seen either playing only 2 or a full 4 copies, but, this card is Soul Blast 1, retire itself to draw a card at the end of the battle it boosts, so it's a temporary body on the board that you can then trade in for a card from deck, which, because Hexaorb needs to Persona Ride, I think you're going to find yourself wanting to draw cards more. Like, I kind of wrote this card off when I first saw it because I was thinking, like, why would I want to retire things on the board, but just digging for Hexaorb is very important, and so this is kind of a reluctant play, just because you kind of need its effect. One nice thing about getting off the board, though, is that it can't be imprisoned, so in a tournament setting where I'm not 100% sure what's going to show up, that's nice to have. And, just any other target effects, like Bastion has that order that bottom decks a column, or even just like Eden's on hit. Giving them less targets to aim at is always a good thing, so, if you have like this and Pentagleam in like your early game, you can kind of mulligan your early hand a little bit, while also still having temporary bodies on the board, so that's pretty neat for early game plays, and then, because they're kind of disposable, you don't really mind if they're imprisoned or retired or whatever. Next, we have 3 copies of Divine Sister Tartine, so this card is very important. It is on play, you Soul Blast 1 and rest it, so look at your top 2, put 1 on top, 1 on bottom, so it's very nice for guaranteeing more than 1 trigger on your, like, Persona Ride Hexaorb turn, or if it's, like, a bit earlier in the game, it's a way for you to kind of search your deck. It's a way for you to kind of search your deck for any triggers, so that's pretty nice, and again, it's not the most important body on the board. I think that's one advantage that Hexaorb has coming into a meta where you have, like, Eden's on hit, you have Imprisoned, you have Verena with retiring, so just having unimportant bodies that you can use to maybe bait out some of these skills if your opponent isn't thinking about it too much. It's kind of nice to have. The main reason I'm running 3 copies of this is just because I don't know where my 4th copy went. Like, I searched through all of my commons, and I just could not find the 4th copy of Tartine, even though I want 4 copies of her. I think I would have gone to 2 Painkiller, 4 of this if I could actually find that 4th copy, so that's kind of part of the reason why my ratios are all weird in this list. Next, we have 2 tier square Sorceress, so her skill is like, when you drive check a trigger, you can counterblast 1 to bottom deck a front row rear guard, so against all of those other decks I mentioned, you know, you have like Bastion with Alden, Overdress just in general, getting rid of any Varina is always helpful, you know, so having the ability to snipe a key rear guard is pretty important. Unfortunately, it costs a counterblast, which this deck is actually pretty counterblast heavy between Lapisto, Alden, and Hexaorb herself, so that's the main reason I've cut this down to 2 copies, because I actually anticipate that I might want this skill a lot, but the thing is, I don't know if I can afford it as consistently as I would maybe want to, just because of how counterblast heavy this deck is, and that is a huge reason why Fasciata at 4 is so important for this list. And then we have 2 of Divine Sister Fasciata. So when your drive check reveals a trigger unit, you can Soul Blast 2 to counter charge 1. So the only thing with this is Soul Blast 2 is a lot. You do need it for Hexaorb herself, as well as Painkiller Angel and Alden if you're in this particular list anyways, which is why I cut this down to 2 copies, because when I was doing my test games, I just didn't really feel the need to use this card that often. Although, with the tweaks I've made since then by adding Alden, I think it might become irrelevant, so still keeping 2 copies. JP lists I've seen kind of vary. I've seen a lot of lists go full 4 copies with this card, but I've also seen a number of them only use 2, so, you know, as of right now, I think I put more stock into Fasciata's on-hit as both a more reliable resource engine that doesn't cost me any of my other resources that I need. But yeah, still have 2 copies just because any countercharging I can get with this list is unfortunately kind of needed, even if I don't think it's the greatest countercharger. And of course, just 4 copies of the PG. This is the main set PG, where if you have not enough cards in your hand, then it is a 1-card PG. Anyways, trigger ratio. This one is another thing I've like debated a little bit about. I am running 8 criticals at the very least, because that's kind of the deck's bread and butter, is just stacking all those crits, getting a buttload of power, and going at it. I've considered running front triggers, but when I was testing this before the set released on like CFA, I found that front triggers a lot of the time didn't help me as much as just getting straight up criticals. Like, the games where I hit double crits were just so much smoother than getting a front trigger, so full 8 crits. And, of course, we also have 4 heals. You know, pretty self-explanatory. You like healing. Heals are good. Of course, we have our 1 over trigger, because as long as these goddamn things are legal, that's just going in the deck. And of course, we're playing the actual Keter Sanctuary one, because who doesn't want 6 drive checks in a turn, right? And finally, I am opting to play 3 draw triggers right now, so my logic here is that if I do check the over trigger, it acts as effectively my 4th draw, so that's why I'm opting for 3 draws right now. And I chose draws instead of fronts just because I think even with Alden in the deck, this deck is going to have advantage problems. I was considering maybe playing more draw triggers, but then that would take away from my crit ratio, and you can't stack the draw triggers back on top of your deck, unfortunately, so that's just not an option for me. But the reason why I chose not to go for front triggers is, yeah, just advantage. Kinda need it to not lose, or just to dig for some of your essential pieces, especially more copies of Hexaorb. So, this is my full list kind of laid out for all of you to see. For the matchups I'm considering, I did play against Atlas using Zorga, so I kind of know how that goes a little bit. Zorga, depending on how it opens up, could take a little bit to just set up the drop zone and get itself going, so I think that is a winnable matchup for me. Like, Hexaorb, to begin with, is not the greatest deck out of all of the ones available. I'm kind of going in with this one just for my own convenience and to have fun, because that is the core of why we play in these tournaments. But yeah, so for potential matchups, Zorga could be I think is a winnable one. Like, that one takes a bit of brain work to both build and play properly, so I kind of anticipate that being one of the winnable matchups. Ones I'm more concerned about are, like, obviously the big decks like Bruce and Bastion. I think Bruce is another one where, both because it requires a lot of brain power and because of how inherently slow it is, I kind of anticipate that being a feasible matchup for this deck, and, you know, Bastion is a bit of a harder matchup for me personally, just because I'm not sure if I'm going to have the resources to damage deny Bastion and still have a big enough burst turn to be able to take him down quickly, you know? So I think Bastion is just going to be a difficult matchup because of how consistent and powerful that deck is. Overdress, it kind of depends. I think the two toppies of Tier Square here are really going to be helpful for that particular matchup. Just getting rid of a Valiant or even just an Arcus before it becomes Valiant will be a good way to slow Overdress down. I did playtest against Prison a fair amount, just with Chris before the set came out. I think that's a pretty doable matchup. Orphist is one I'm not 100% sure about. That one might just be, like, because of how easy it is to just get shadow armies on the board, that might, ironically enough, be a fairly easy matchup for Orphist, just because of how weak Hexaorb is overall. Not super concerned about the mirror. I feel like that just comes down to whoever checks more triggers. Yeah. So, I'm kind of anticipating not doing particularly well with this list, if I'm being perfectly honest. Gotta maintain Nexus at Night's sterling reputation for being terrible at this game, but, you know, at the end I'm having fun, so we will report back at the end of Springfest to see how well I did and whether my particular deck building choices panned out for me. Oh, and I guess I forgot to mention Borrow Magnus during all of those potential matchups. And Eugene too, but I don't really anticipate seeing a lot of Eugenes. Borrow Magnus, though, was topping quite a bit in Japan. I think it's dropped off since Festival Collection, but I don't know. We could end up seeing a decent number of Borrow Magnuses just because it was doing well in Japan early on. As far as that matchup goes, I feel like if I could get those early game triggers, you know, rushing early with disposable cards like Pentagleam, that matchup should be pretty manageable. So, you know, again, I think overall I'm going to have a fairly medium time. Hey, thanks for watching, everybody. If you like this video, leave a like, leave a comment. Do you agree with my deck building choices? Do you think me playing like 2 and 3-ofs of most of my list is really weird and stupid? How badly do you think I'm gonna get my butt kicked once the tournament actually begins? Let us know. What are you going to bring to Springfest? Thank you to our $10 patrons, Darren, Cole, and Josh. If you would like to donate to our Patreon, $5 gets you a whole-ass bonus show, $10 gives you early access to our videos, and a shout-out like I did just now, so the early access is for any non-news content, so like fight videos and boxings and deck lists like this. You'll get them earlier than the general public. So, thank you again for watching. If you want to follow us on our social medias, you can follow the show at Nexus at Night. I am Plasma Eclipse. Atlas is at Atlas Novak. Matt is Wiggums with 2Gs, 2Zs. All of the links will be in the description. Thank you for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.